More friendship and less sex. That's the preference expressed by Gen Z for the media they watch, according to a new study out of UCLA. According to the annual Teens and Screens report, today's adolescents want less sex and less aspiration, and more storylines reflecting lives like their own. The survey found the majority of adolescents wanted to see more content centered around friendships and platonic relationships. 44% felt romance was overused in media. Astonishingly, 39% wanted to see more aromantic or asexual characters on screen. Adolescents also expressed dissatisfaction with several tropes, such as the expectation that male-female friends would fall in love. The findings correlate with several studies on decline of sexual intercourse among Gen Z. A 2021 study by the CDC reported that 30% of teens said they'd had sex, down from 50% in decades prior. Imagine, if you will, the original Star Wars saga without any sexual tension or even romance between Han and Leia, that their sacrifices and trials weren't given depth and poignancy by their emerging and ultimately powerful feelings for one another. Imagine The Breakfast Club without the unexpected and compelling pairing up of the misfit outsider and princess characters. Imagine Dirty Dancing involving a chaste and platonic pairing for whom the dance contest in itself was the dramatic stakes of the film. Top Gun, in which Kelly McGillis and Tom Cruise assiduously abide by professional workplace etiquette about relationships and remain separate. Or A Princess Bride, in which Westley and Buttercup don't share a passionate kiss. Well, in a sense, that is exactly what we've got now. Just at the moment when, after lamenting the lack of representation in the writing room for decades, and the lack of fully realized female empowerment on screen, Gen Z, and in particular female Gen Z writers, are starting to make their presence felt and get leverage in the writing room. They are acting in a spirit of abnegation and producing female characters that are boring, aromantic, and practically sexless. Rey Skywalker's chaste relations with her two buddies, Galadriel's prickly girl boss transcendence of intimate relations, Ahsoka drifting about monastically in her space caravan for years, Sabine and Ezra Bridger being just pals who don't manage or want anything beyond a quick hug, and Captain Marvel hovering chastely in space for half a decade before embarking upon shenanigans in which nobody has even the faintest prospects or inclinations towards intimacy. The Teens and Screens report quoted Olivia Rodrigo, who said, "I remember walking out of Barbie and being like, wow, it's so long since I've seen a movie that is female-centered in a way that isn't sexual or about her pain or her being traumatized." It's kind of weird and a little bit sad. The current or emerging generational outlook is wholly new in that, paradoxically, their notion of escapism is ideally just a reflection of their reality. Of topics Gen Z wanted to see, the top preferences were hopeful, uplifting content with people beating the odds, and characters with lives more like their own, which reportedly means less romance and more platonic relationships. This is also sad because it recontextualizes romance and sexual intimacy, not so much as ideal, urgent things to naturally gravitate toward, as an enticing threshold to meet an engine of personal growth, but as just another potentially problematic strain. And, worst of all, through such cultural and media messaging, some young women have been positioned to interpret, latently, romantic attachment as a form of compromise. Take a look through the top 20 films of last year, and this year, and the one thing you'll notice is a strange modern puritanism. There's nary a sex scene, flash of skin, tantalizing hint of tits and ass, eroticism, or characters getting it on in conventional sex scenes. For the top 20 films in a year to contain not a single steamy shower scene is something audiences from yesteryear would have thought disgraceful, unacceptable, and might have led to some form of public demonstrations, skirmishes with riot police, the issue being raised in parliamentary question time, and major figures being hauled before Congress to account for the phenomenon. The anomaly here is Gen Z's strong appetite for frank, unabashed, highly romantic and often highly erotic and sensual queer sexual representation on screen. There has been a plethora in the last few years of gay-centered dramas that have performed well critically and commercially, such as Love, Simon, Young Royals, Ellie and the Self-Contained episode in The Last of Us, and Heartstopper, and many more. All of these shows have been identity and sex positive. The placement and contextualization of queer identity within these mainstream shows have been vivid, while the hetero equivalents seem to elicit wariness or ambivalence in the younger viewership. Some of this ambiguity might be attributed to the culture, and by extension Hollywood, attempting to empower children, particularly little girls, by deconstructing fairy tale tropes which might be seen as dated and restricting about princes and princesses and quests and sentimental romantic yearning, and passive or literally sleeping beauties without agency, having to be rescued by a valiant young man, and wistful notions of courtly love and consummation with a kiss, and happily ever after. You saw this most contentiously in the ramblings of Rachel Zegler, who tried so hard to recontextualize Snow White as a heroine whose destiny is primarily about finding agency, and romantic notions at the heart of the fairy tale being shunted aside and left ambiguous. What she and the writers failed to conceptualize was the kind of expressive and narrative sterility that ensues, as well as the fact there's actually nothing wrong with girls and young women having sweet, one day my prince will come fantasies, integrated into a wider array of empowerment and agency fantasies, that they're not mutually exclusive or contradictory, that it's part of the messy and lively development of identity. If the culture and Hollywood tries to negate those fantasies, with Elsa in Frozen, the empowered princess with her own song and the Aladdin remake, and all the similar modern archetypes, then, in addition to instilling a mindset of independence and agency, you instill latent, abstract disparagements and misgivings about the romantic tropes you've displaced. And much of those misgivings, evidently, have subsisted through into this generation's attitudes about romantic and sexual identity. The boys, for their part, are seemingly less interested in media that in previous generations appealed to ideas of power fantasy. The superhero genre at its height 10 years ago, and before that the machismo of the 80s, and before that the cowboy genre with its rugged frontiers. The power fantasy tropes were pushed relentlessly by the studios onto girls, with standalone, almost supernaturally powerful figures like Captain Marvel, and an array of ever more prominent female sidekicks, increasingly taking the narrative reins. But with girls just not connecting with such power fantasy equality pushes designed to empower them. Another fascinating element of the UCLA report is its finding that teens overwhelmingly disapprove of aspirational content about wealth and fame. This is also kind of sad because it's part of American cultural DNA. Stephen Milhouse's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Martin Dressler, for example, imagines a young second-generation immigrant who rises from humble origins to become a Manhattan mogul during America's Gilded Age, a novel that becomes a phantasmagoria of fantastical, boundless imagination and is shot through with the ecstatic desires for wealth and opportunity. In film, this subgenre of entrepreneurial mania and desire and ambition always produces great work. The Founder, about a half-shyster, half-visionary who fucks over people in his way to make McDonald's the modern colossus of today. Tetris, BlackBerry, and The Social Network, described by Quentin Tarantino as one of the best films of the modern age, in part because of its fierce rivalries, insatiable ambitious hungers, avarice, and the high-strung, extremely masculine drives for innovation, success, and excess. This isn't to Gen Z's taste, however. Their preference, unaccountably, is for sympathetic camaraderie, an intimacy of solace in the face of a hostile world of environmental and societal malaise and decay. Something like the turn-on, tune-in, drop-out slogan of Timothy Leary, but with an even more solipsistic, chaste element. Unfortunately, this Gen Z mindset carries more negatives than positives. It is passive, shuns potentialities, misses the blood and guts of life, and leads to the kind of repressions that lacerate the soul through the denial of the natural, the sensual, the ideal. Gen Z may feel they're doing their best. Well, let Sean Connery have the last word.
Your best. Losers always whine about their best. Winners go home and fuck the prom queen.